The black car had been parked outside the Bennett house for 6 full minutes before anyone worked up the nerve to knock. Maya Bennett watched it from her kitchen window, dish towel forgotten in her hands, heart slamming against her ribs like it already knew something she didn't. Nobody parked cars like that on Larkspur Street. Not the kind of car that costs more than every house on the block combined. Not in a town where half the driveways sat empty because the plant had gone quiet 8 months ago and taken half the paychecks with it. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out who Maya recognized instantly from a magazine cover her son had cut out and taped above his bed, and her stomach dropped through the floor, because she suddenly understood, with sick certainty, exactly why he was here. 8 days earlier, her 8-year-old son had done something he never told her about. He'd written a letter, sealed it himself, walked it to the post office on his own 2 feet with $3 of birthday money for the stamp, and somehow, impossibly, that letter had found its way past 100 layers of assistants and lawyers and gatekeepers, straight into the hands of one of the richest men in the country. Now that man was standing on her cracked front walkway, letter in hand, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Neither of them had any idea, in that frozen moment on the porch, that this single knock was about to unravel a secret Maya had buried for 9 years, and hand an entire dying town a second chance nobody had dared to hope for. Stay with me, because what was written in that letter isn't what saved them. It's what came after it that changed everything. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that showed up on maps mostly out of habit. Population just under 4,000, one blinking traffic light, a diner that had served the same meatloaf special since 1987, and, until 8 months ago, a manufacturing plant that had employed nearly a third of the working adults in the county. Cross Fabrication Works had built precision parts for aerospace contractors for 3 generations, a steady hum of machinery that Maya Bennett had fallen asleep to her entire childhood. The same hum her late husband, Daniel, had worked inside for 9 years before an aneurysm took him at 34, standing at his station on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Maya had been a widow for 2 years now, raising Jonah alone in the small blue house on Larkspur Street that Daniel had spent one whole summer painting himself. She worked mornings at the elementary school cafeteria and evenings cleaning offices downtown, a schedule built entirely around being home when Jonah's bus pulled up at 3:15. It wasn't much of a life by some measures. It was, until 8 months ago, a stable one. Then Cross Fabrication's parent company, run from a glass tower 4 states away by a reclusive billionaire named Nathaniel Cross, announced the Maple Hollow plant would be closing by the end of the year. Corporate restructuring, the press release called it. Consolidating operations. Standard language for what everyone in town understood plainly. The last real employer within 40 miles was shutting its doors, and it was taking Maple Hollow's future down with it. Jonah didn't fully understand economics or corporate consolidation. What he understood was that his best friend's dad had moved the family to Ohio looking for work. What he understood was that the diner where his mother sometimes treated him to milkshakes had cut its hours in half. What he understood, with the simple, devastating clarity that only children seem to access, was that his father used to work at that plant, and that if it disappeared completely, one more piece of Daniel Bennett would disappear along with it. So on a rainy Tuesday in October, while Maya was at work, Jonah sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and 3 sheets of notebook paper, and he wrote a letter to Nathaniel Cross. He didn't ask for a job. He didn't ask for money, not directly. He wrote about his dad, about the sound the plant used to make that you could hear from 3 streets over, about how his mom cried sometimes at night when she thought he was asleep, though he always heard through the thin bedroom wall. He wrote, in careful 8-year-old handwriting that wandered slightly uphill across the page, that he didn't know Mr. Cross personally, but that his teacher said rich people sometimes did nice things if you just asked them nicely, and that he was asking nicely if there was any way to keep the plant open, because his town needed it more than Mr. Cross probably needed the money. He signed it Jonah Daniel Bennett, age 8, Maple Hollow. He found the company's corporate headquarters address on the back of an old company newsletter his mother kept in a drawer. He walked to the post office alone after school, using birthday money his grandmother had sent for exactly this kind of impulsive 8-year-old decision, and mailed it without telling a single soul. He fully expected nothing to happen. Letters from children to famous strangers, he assumed, probably went straight into a trash can somewhere. What Jonah didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Nathaniel Cross's assistant of 11 years had a standing, unbreakable rule. Any piece of mail addressed by hand, in a child's handwriting, went directly onto his desk unopened, no exceptions. It was a rule that existed for reasons Nathaniel Cross had never fully explained to anyone on his staff. Reasons buried in a part of his life he didn't discuss even with his closest colleagues. The letter sat on his desk for 2 days before he finally opened it, late on a Thursday night, alone in an office 40 floors above a city Jonah had never seen. He read it once quickly. Then he read it again slowly. Then, according to the assistant who found him there past midnight, he sat perfectly still for almost 20 minutes, staring at a child's uneven handwriting, before picking up his phone and asking for his driver to be ready first thing in the morning. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He simply got in the car and drove 11 hours to a town he'd only ever seen on a spreadsheet, carrying a letter that had somehow cracked something open in him that 4 years of grief counseling and a small mountain of money had never quite reached. Which was how, 8 days after a boy dropped an envelope into a mailbox with trembling hands, one of the richest men in America ended up standing on a cracked front walkway in Maple Hollow, working up the courage to knock on a stranger's door. "Mrs. Bennett?" His voice, when Maya finally opened the door, was quieter than she expected from someone whose face she'd seen on the cover of a business magazine. Less polished. More uncertain. "I'm Nathaniel Cross. I believe your son wrote to me." For a long moment Maya simply stared at him, several conflicting emotions warring across her face at once. Confusion, embarrassment, a flash of protective anger on Jonah's behalf, and underneath all of it, a raw, exhausted hope she'd been trying not to feel for 8 months. "He didn't tell me," she finally managed. "I had no idea he'd. I'm so sorry if he bothered you, Mr. Cross. That's not. He's 8. He doesn't understand that you can't just." "He understood exactly what he was doing," Nathaniel interrupted gently, holding up the letter, now soft and slightly worn at the folds from handling. "He understood it better than my entire executive team apparently, none of whom thought to mention what closing this plant would actually do to a town like this. They gave me consolidation charts, Mrs. Bennett. Your son gave me the truth." Behind Maya, small footsteps thundered down the hallway, and Jonah appeared in the doorway, eyes going wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief as he recognized the man from the magazine cover standing on his own front porch. "You came," he said, barely above a whisper, as if saying it any louder might make the impossible moment disappear. Nathaniel knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Jonah's eye level with the same careful, deliberate movement of a man unused to physical vulnerability but trying anyway. "I came," he confirmed. "I read every word, Jonah. I want you to know that. Every single word." "Are you going to keep the plant open?" Jonah asked, with the direct bluntness only children seem capable of, cutting straight past every social nicety adults would have observed first. Nathaniel glanced up at Maya, something uncertain and searching in his expression, before answering. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I came here to find out the truth before I let anyone make that decision for me from a spreadsheet 4 states away. Would you two mind showing me your town? I think I've been making decisions about it without ever actually seeing it." What Nathaniel Cross didn't say, what he wouldn't say for several more days, was that Jonah's letter had done something no boardroom presentation ever could. It had reminded him, with brutal and unexpected force, of another 8-year-old boy who used to write him notes and leave them on his desk before school. A boy named Eli, who had died 4 years earlier from a rare heart condition nobody had caught in time, taking with him every ordinary morning Nathaniel had once taken for granted while building an empire that, in the end, Eli would barely get to see. Nathaniel Cross had spent 4 years since then running his company like a machine with the emotion carefully engineered out of it, because emotion, he'd learned, was where the unbearable parts lived. Jonah's letter had cracked that machine wide open in a single evening, and he hadn't yet figured out what to do with everything spilling out of the gap. The tour of Maple Hollow took most of the afternoon. Jonah insisted on showing Nathaniel every important location with the seriousness of a tiny tour guide. The diner with the legendary meatloaf, now open only 4 days a week, the elementary school where budget cuts had eliminated the art teacher's position, the shuttered hardware store whose owner had moved to be near his daughter after the plant layoffs made the mortgage impossible. Maya trailed a careful few steps behind, watching the richest man she'd ever stood near actually listen with none of the practiced impatience she'd expected, to every story her son insisted on telling. "He talks about your husband," Nathaniel said quietly, as Jonah ran ahead toward the old plant gates, pressing his face against the chain-link fence to peer at the silent building beyond. In the letter. And now, every third sentence somehow finds its way back to his father. Daniel worked there 9 years, Maya said, her voice carefully controlled in the way she'd learned to talk about her husband in public, steady enough that it wouldn't crack open in front of strangers. He was proud of what he built there. Jonah barely remembers him honestly, he was 3 when Daniel died. But he's built this whole idea of who his father was partly out of that plant, out of what people say about him in town. If it closes completely, disappears, gets sold for scrap. It's one more way his father disappears. Nathaniel finished quietly, understanding settling into his expression with visible weight. I know exactly what that kind of disappearing feels like. Something in the way he said it made Maya study him more carefully. Not the tabloid billionaire from magazine covers, calculating and untouchable, but a man carrying something heavy and private behind carefully guarded eyes. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place, not yet, not with a man she'd known for exactly 4 hours. But she filed the observation away, a small crack of humanity in a person she'd expected to find entirely made of boardroom armor. By the time the afternoon light began fading gold across the empty plant parking lot, Nathaniel had made a decision that would, within 72 hours, put him directly at war with his own board of directors. I'd like to stay a few days, he said as they walked back toward Larkspur Street, Jonah several yards ahead, chasing something imaginary through the fallen leaves. Talk to people who actually worked here. Understand what I'd be shutting down before I let a committee I've never properly supervised make that call for me by default. You're the CEO, Maya pointed out, unable to keep the skepticism entirely out of her voice. Can't you just decide? I can, Nathaniel said, a rueful, complicated expression crossing his face. The board can also remove me if enough of them decide I've stopped acting like a rational businessman and started acting like a man moved by a child's handwriting. Which, at the moment, is a fairly accurate description of exactly what's happening to me. The admission, delivered with such plain honesty, startled a short laugh out of Maya, the first genuine one in longer than she wanted to admit. 3 days turned into a week. Nathaniel checked into the only motel in town, the Maple Hollow Inn, a modest 12-room building that hadn't seen a guest of his profile in its 40-year history, and spent his mornings walking the plant floor with former employees, his afternoons in the diner listening to stories about the town's history over meatloaf he insisted, with apparent sincerity, was the best he'd ever eaten. He met Jonah after school most days, at first with Maya's cautious permission, then eventually at Jonah's own increasingly confident insistence. He learned to throw a baseball with something approaching competence, corrected by Jonah's patient 8-year-old coaching. He sat through an entire dinosaur documentary marathon on a Saturday afternoon, absorbing facts about the Cretaceous period with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than polite endurance. He began arriving at the Bennett house with small, thoughtful things, a book about aerospace engineering he thought Jonah might like given his father's work, a set of paints for Maya after Jonah mentioned offhand that she used to paint before Daniel died and somehow never found the time again. You don't have to keep doing this, Maya told him one evening on her porch steps, watching him help Jonah with a math worksheet spread across the top porch stair. Whatever you decide about the plant, you don't owe us this time. Attention. I know I don't owe it, Nathaniel said, not looking up from where he was patiently explaining fractions using a spare sheet of paper folded into careful sections. That's rather the point, Mrs. Bennett. I've spent 4 years surrounded by people who need something from me. This is the first time in longer than I can remember that I've simply wanted to be somewhere. The observation hung in the cooling evening air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to name. It was Catherine O'Say, Nathaniel's chief financial officer and the board's most vocal skeptic of his sudden, unscheduled disappearance, who finally forced the growing tension into the open. She flew into the regional airport unannounced on a Thursday morning, tracked Nathaniel down at the diner over breakfast, and slid into the booth across from him with the barely contained fury of an executive whose CEO had gone dark for 9 days over what appeared, from the outside, to be a sentimental detour. The board is asking questions I can't answer, she said without preamble, ignoring Maya and Jonah entirely at the next table. Questions like why our CEO drove 11 hours based on a letter from a child, and has apparently spent the last week playing house with a widow and her son instead of managing an $8 billion company. The plant stays open, Nathaniel said quietly, the words landing with more certainty than he'd allowed himself all week, as if saying them aloud finally made the decision real. I want a full retrofit plan on my desk within 30 days. Modern equipment, expanded contracts, everything it needs to actually compete rather than limp along until the next convenient excuse to shut it down. Catherine's expression tightened into something between disbelief and alarm. Do you understand what that costs? What it does to our quarterly projections? The board approved this closure 8 months ago based on solid financial modeling, Nathaniel, not on a letter from an 8-year-old. The financial modeling didn't account for what this town actually is, Nathaniel replied. His voice steady despite the visible tension building around the table. It accounted for line items. I want new modeling. Ones that account for the fact that closing this plant doesn't just cut a cost center. It hollows out an entire community that's been loyal to this company for 3 generations. The board will vote on this, Catherine warned, rising from the booth with clipped, controlled anger. You know that. You can't simply decree it from a diner booth in a town this small. Then let them vote, Nathaniel said. I'll be there to make the case myself. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, back at corporate headquarters, and the stakes had shifted, almost overnight, from an internal restructuring decision into something closer to a referendum on Nathaniel Cross's judgment as CEO. Word had leaked, sources within the company were never publicly identified, but the timing suggested Catherine's office, and a business journalist had already published a speculative piece questioning whether grief, sentiment, or an unusual personal attachment had compromised the CEO's decision-making regarding cross-fabrication works. Maya read the article standing in her kitchen, hands trembling slightly with a complicated mixture of guilt and fury on Nathaniel's behalf. This is because of us, she said when he arrived that evening, looking more exhausted than she'd seen him all week. Because of Jonah's letter. We've put you in an impossible position. You've put me in an honest position, Nathaniel corrected, settling heavily onto her porch steps in a way that had become oddly familiar over the past 10 days, which is considerably more uncomfortable, admittedly, than the comfortable, dishonest one I was in before. What happens if the board votes against you? Maya asked, sitting down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then I'm outvoted on my own board, which has happened exactly never in the company's history, Nathaniel said with a humorless half-smile. Or I use my controlling share position to override them, which I've also never done, because it sets a precedent about unilateral decision-making that could genuinely damage the company's governance in the long run. He turned to look at her directly. Or I find a way to convince them this isn't sentiment at all, that it's actually the smarter long-term business decision. If we're willing to invest properly instead of managing decline. Is it? Maya asked. The smarter decision, I mean. Not just the kinder one. Nathaniel considered the question with visible seriousness, the same careful weighing she'd watched him apply to Jonah's math homework days earlier. I think communities that trust their employer perform better over a 20-year horizon than ones treated as disposable cost centers, he said finally. I think loyalty, actually invested in, generates returns nobody bothers to model because it's harder to put in a spreadsheet than a layoff number. I believe that. But I'll admit, Maya, I didn't believe it strongly enough to act on it until an 8-year-old's handwriting made me actually look at what I was closing instead of what I was consolidating. It was the first time he'd used her first name. Neither of them commented on it, though Maya felt the small shift settle somewhere warm beneath her ribs. The board meeting, when it arrived, unfolded in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above a city Jonah had begged, unsuccessfully, to be allowed to see in person. Maya watched a live stream of the public portion from her kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a cooling cup of coffee, while Jonah sat beside her, uncharacteristically quiet, sensing without fully understanding the weight of what was happening. Nathaniel stood before 11 board members and presented a case built not on sentiment, as the leaked article had predicted, but on hard revised numbers, retrofit costs offset by new aerospace contracts his team had spent the week quietly securing, community investment tax incentives Maya hadn't even known existed, a 5-year projection that showed the retrofitted plant outperforming its current declining trajectory within 18 months. But it was the closing minutes of his presentation that Maya would remember most clearly, the moment the live stream camera caught Nathaniel setting aside his prepared slides entirely. "I want to read something to you," he said, and pulled a folded, worn piece of notebook paper from his jacket pocket. Jonah's letter, carried with him through every meeting of the past week. This came from an 8-year-old boy in Maple Hollow, addressed to me personally, mailed with his own birthday money. I'm not going to read all of it, because some of it belongs to his family and not to this boardroom. But I want to read one sentence, because I think it says more about what we do than any deck my team has ever built for me. He unfolded the letter carefully and read in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier corporate polish. "My dad worked there and I don't remember him that good, but everybody says the plant is where he was happiest, and if it goes away I feel like one more piece of him goes away too, and I don't have that many pieces left." Silence settled over the boardroom, visible even through the grainy livestream feed. Maya felt tears sliding down her face before she fully registered she was crying, Jonah's small hand finding hers across the kitchen table without either of them saying a word. "That's not a metric on any spreadsheet," Nathaniel continued quietly. "But it's the truest thing anyone has told me about what this company actually does in the world, and I think we owe the people who built this business 3 generations of loyalty something more honest than a consolidation memo. I'm asking you to vote for the retrofit plan. Not because it's sentimental, because I believe with the numbers in front of you it's genuinely the smarter path forward, and because I think we've forgotten somewhere in the last decade that those two things were never supposed to be opposites." The vote, when it finally came, wasn't unanimous. Catherine Osei abstained, still visibly uneasy about the precedent of a CEO's personal experience driving major capital allocation. But 7 of 11 board members voted in favor, enough to approve the retrofit plan, and with it, the survival of cross-fabrication works and the town built quietly around its heartbeat. The town celebration, 3 weeks later, filled Maple Hollow's small central square with more people than Maya had seen gathered in one place since Daniel's funeral, though this time the occasion couldn't have been more different. Strings of lights crossed between the diner and the old hardware store, now reopening under new ownership with a small business grant that had appeared, unattributed but unmistakably sourced, in the mail the week after the board vote. The plant's retrofit crews had already begun work, new equipment scheduled to arrive within the month, rehiring notices posted for former employees scattered across 3 states. Jonah stood at the center of it all, uncomfortable with the attention but clearly quietly proud, as the mayor read a brief proclamation thanking by name an 8-year-old boy whose letter had done what 8 months of petitions and pleading emails to corporate headquarters had failed to accomplish. "You could have just written a check," Maya said to Nathaniel later, as the crowd thinned and the evening settled into something quieter, the two of them standing slightly apart near the old plant fence where Jonah had first pressed his face against the chain link 10 weeks earlier. "Saved the plant from 4 states away. Never had to actually come here." "I could have," Nathaniel agreed. "It's what I would have done a year ago, honestly. Solve the problem, wire the money. Never look too closely at what it actually meant for the people involved." He turned to face her fully, something vulnerable and unguarded in his expression that she'd rarely seen from him even after 10 weeks of near-daily visits. "But your son's letter didn't ask me for a solution, Maya. It asked me to actually see something I'd been avoiding looking at for a very long time. And once I started looking, I found I didn't particularly want to stop." "At the plant," Maya clarified carefully, her heart beating faster than the question warranted. "Or at us?" Nathaniel's answer wasn't immediate, but it was honest, delivered with the same deliberate care he brought to everything since the night he'd first opened a child's letter alone in an empty office. "Both," he admitted. "Though if I'm being entirely truthful, the second one has become considerably harder to look away from than the first." Maya felt something in her chest that had been carefully, protectively closed for 2 years finally begin, cautiously, to open. "Jonah would probably say you should tell me that with less corporate phrasing," she offered, a small smile breaking through despite herself. "Jonah's already informed me in no uncertain terms that grown-ups are, and I quote, way too slow about this stuff," Nathaniel said, a genuine laugh escaping him, warm and unguarded in a way that transformed his entire face. "He may have also suggested quite specifically that I ask you to dinner. An actual dinner. Without spreadsheets or board votes involved." "And what did you tell him?" Maya asked, though something in her chest already knew the answer, already wanted it. I told him I intended to ask myself in my own time without an 8-year-old's negotiating tactics, Nathaniel said. Then quieter, more uncertain than she'd ever heard the confident businessman sound. Would you have dinner with me, Maya? Not as the CEO who saved your town. Just as the man who's spent 10 weeks discovering he'd rather be here, in Maple Hollow, than anywhere else his money could take him. 6 months later, the plant floor at Cross Fabrication Works hummed again with the steady, familiar rhythm Maya remembered from her childhood, new machinery gleaming alongside equipment that had run for 3 decades, nearly 400 employees back on payroll, with hiring still ongoing. The diner had extended its hours back to 7 days a week. The hardware store had a line of customers most Saturday mornings. Maple Hollow, against every prediction in the original consolidation memo, was quietly, stubbornly coming back to life. Nathaniel had relocated a satellite executive office to a renovated building 2 blocks from Larkspur Street, splitting his time between headquarters and a town that had, without either of them quite planning it, become something very close to a second home. He still worked impossible hours. He still occasionally disappeared into calls that lasted long into the evening. But most nights now found him at the Bennett kitchen table, helping with math homework that had, mercifully, moved on from fractions, or sitting beside Maya on the porch steps where an impossible knock on the door had first rearranged both their lives. On a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring, Jonah stood at the plant's newly reopened gates, holding a small brass plaque his mother had commissioned quietly, without telling anyone what it said until the unveiling. It hung beside the main entrance, simple and unassuming among the gleaming new equipment and freshly painted walls. In memory of Daniel Bennett, who built things that lasted, and in honor of his son, who wrote the letter that brought this place back to life. Jonah read it 3 times, tracing the letters with one finger, before turning to look at his mother and the man standing quietly beside her, who had, somewhere in the last 6 months, without any of them quite naming the moment out loud, become something close to family. Dad would have liked you, Jonah said to Nathaniel with the same blunt, unfiltered honesty that had started this entire impossible chain of events. Even though you're kind of slow about the important stuff. Nathaniel laughed, the sound carrying easily across the plant yard. Unguarded in a way the man who'd first knocked on that cracked front walkway 6 months earlier would hardly have recognized in himself. I'm working on it, he said, reaching down to ruffle Jonah's hair before glancing at Maya with something warm and certain in his eyes. Turns out the important stuff was worth taking my time to get right. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the end. If Jonah and Maya's journey moved you, let me know in the comments which part hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories about second chances, unexpected kindness, and the families that build themselves in the most unlikely ways, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that small, honest acts can change everything. What would you have written in Jonah's letter? Tell me below.